Welcome to Chapter 2. In this chapter, we're going to build another Hello World style application, except we're going to introduce the concept of proof of concepting. This is going to allow us to build applications and break down problems in new ways that will make things easier for us. In this particular chapter, we're going to explore S3. We're going to set up our first bucket and understand some of the features in S3. We won't be diving all the way into S3 and learning it exhaustively, as that's a little beyond the scope of this course, but we will need to understand how the service works well enough to code against it. Let's go ahead and get started. For this project, we're going to be using some other AWS services. So that's going to require us to manage the security between those services and learn more about those services. In this example, what we're going to do is we're going to receive a parameter from the invoking agent of our Lambda function, write that value to an S3 bucket, and then provide a way to retrieve that value later. First, let's talk a little bit about what S3 is. S3 is a storage engine. It stands for Simple Storage System, in fact, S3. One of the great things about S3 is that it's basically unlimited and bottomless storage. Think of a hard drive that never runs out of space and that you can use all kinds of features with. Let's take a look at these features by creating a bucket together. As always, we're going to start by logging into our AWS Management Console. Now let's go ahead and navigate to the S3 section of AWS. Once you're here, you'll see a fairly basic interface. The very first thing you need to understand is that S3 is organized into buckets, and these buckets must be universally unique. So it's common to attach your domain name to the end of the bucket to give it sort of a namespace of its own. Let's go ahead and create a bucket now. Click on Create Bucket. I'm going to name my bucket Eduonix Hello World S3.gregharrington.com. In fact, there's a couple of hyphens in there as well. It doesn't really matter what you name your bucket as long as it's valid inside of S3 and you make sure you keep a copy of it for the programming we'll be doing in just a second. Next up, I'm going to change the region to North Virginia. This is just where I do most of my programming. You can change this to wherever you want to do most of your programming. And if we had any settings that we wanted to copy from another bucket, this is where we would do it. Right now we don't have any buckets, so we're not going to use this feature. Let's go ahead and move to the next step. So, S3 offers many features. First, versioning. Versioning allows you to keep every version that's ever been created of the same object. So by object, they essentially mean a file. So for instance, if we write a value A to file Z and then update file Z to the value B, then C, then D, and onward, we'd be able to retrieve all of the various historical versions and understand when they were changed. This can be very useful for auditing when a problem arises in a production system or even inside of your development system. Next up, we have server access logging. Server access logging allows us to log a list of all requests to the objects that we put into our bucket. This is useful if you need to create an audit trail down the road. Tags, as you'll find in most AWS systems, are just here so that you can create a key value pair on objects. This is useful if you need to tag large numbers of assets for querying or just for identification purposes. For instance, sometimes people might put environment in the key and either production or QA or test to identify which buckets are used where. Next up, we have object level logging. This is even more in depth than the server access logging above. This actually records every piece of activity that goes towards any object in this bucket. This is useful for very high audit level situations such as medical or banking type applications. Next up, we have encryption. This allows you to encrypt files automatically as they go into S3. We're not going to get too much into encryption right now. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this course and not needed for the educational nature of it. Under advanced settings, you can look up some of these things. Again, we're not going to get too far into these as they're a little bit beyond the scope of this course. What we want to focus on is the serverless programming aspect. And one of the last features I want to take a look at down here is the request metrics. If you're going to have a high access object and need to monitor the amount of usage on it, this is a great way to do it, and CloudWatch is an awesome way to do it. Make sure that you pay attention on any of these features that require additional pricing, and make sure that you understand them before you turn them on. In our case, I'm not going to turn on any of these, and we're going to go ahead and move to the next screen. This next screen sets the permissions for the S3 bucket. There's a lot to know about the permissions on an S3 bucket, as you can see by just the nature of this screen and the 4 checkboxes that all deal with public access. In our case, we want to follow the recommendation that's on this page and block all public access to these. We're going to be using IAM to manage our access to our bucket objects, and we'll grant the resources that need access to our objects. In our case, we're going to handle all of our permissions to objects with IAM and give the specific areas of our software access that need access. So, moving to the next screen, we find that we have essentially just a confirmation screen. Review the changes that you might have made here. However, I suggest you use the same settings I have used just to keep everything the same. And if you need to go back and change one of these pages, just click on the edit button and it'll bounce you back there. After you're done and satisfied with all your changes, go ahead and click Create Bucket. In this video, we learned what S3 is, we learned about some of the features of S3, and we went ahead and created our first bucket. We'll be using that bucket in a later lesson to write some files to. Next, we're going to take a look at IAM and its role that it plays in security for AWS. Let's go ahead and get started on the next video.